cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a brief escape from the hustle of city life. Julia and her husband Matt had found the secluded cabin online, nestled deep in the woods. It promised serenity, a chance to unplug from what they were experiencing in day-to-day life, and the eerie quiet of untouched nature, exactly what they needed. The drive took longer than expected, the winding roads narrowing until they were mere dirt paths, twisting and curling deeper into the forest. By the time they arrived, the sun was dipping behind the treetops, casting long, claw-like shadows across the front of the cabin. The structure was rustic but beautiful in a haunting kind of way. Dark wood weathered by time, a sagging roof, and windows that almost seemed to stare back at them, glass eyes and a lifeless face. Matt joked about it being straight out of a horror movie, laughing off the uneasy feeling that gripped Julia's chest as they unloaded their bags. Inside, the air was heavy, musty with disuse. The floors creaked underfoot, and the wind howled as it snuck through unseen cracks in the wall. Still, the cabin was warm, the fireplace crackling to life as Matt got to work, and they settled in with wine and blankets, watching the first stars appear in the night sky. But the unease persisted. It began with the dreams. That night, Julia woke with a start, her heart racing. She had dreamt of a shadow, something tall and misshapen, standing at the foot of their bed. In her dream, it had no face, just a void where eyes should have been, staring, waiting. She told herself it was only a nightmare, a trick of her tired mind, and rolled over to sleep again. The next morning, she found Matt in the kitchen, staring out the window. His face was pale and his eyes distant. When she asked what was wrong, he shook his head, saying he didn't sleep well, but he couldn't quite remember why. The unease began to fester between them, unspoken but growing. Later that day, hiking in the woods, Julia noticed something strange. Patterns in the trees, almost like symbols. Twisted branches that formed shapes that felt deliberate and unnatural. She pointed them out to Matt, but he dismissed it as her imagination running wild. Still, the sight of them sent chills down her spine, and her dreams that night grew worse. The shadow returned, closer this time. She could feel its presence looming just out of reach, whispering words she could not quite make out. The voice was low, almost guttural, like a language her mind refused to understand. But there was something else, something she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a dream. She was certain now that she had felt it, there, in the room with them, watching. By the third day, the cabin had changed. At first it was subtle, the way the floorboards seemed to groan underfoot, even when no one was walking. The creaking doors that opened and closed on their own. The whispers that both she and Matt started hearing, just out of reach, like a voice carried on the wind. Matt grew distant, his eyes hollow and dark. He claimed nothing was wrong, but Julie could see the fear in his eyes. That night, she woke up to the sound of someone crying. She turned to Matt, but he was sound asleep. The crying grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like it was coming from under the cabin. Heart pounding, she tiptoed to the door, following the sound, which now echoed in the walls. There in the living room, she saw it, a figure standing by the window, the same shadow from her dreams. Its form twisted and wrong, with limbs too long and a head that seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle. It turned to face her, but where its face should have been was nothing but darkness. Frozen in place, Julia couldn't scream. She couldn't move. It whispered her name in a low, rasping sound that sent a wave of nausea through her. In that moment, she realized the truth. The cabin wasn't just secluded, it was alive, or at least something within it was. Something that had been waiting, lurking. She ran to Matt, shaking him awake, but when he opened his eyes, they weren't his. His pupils had dilated, black as the void, staring at her without recognition. He smiled, but it was wrong. Too wide, too sinister. "Julia," he said, his voice distorted, blending with the whispers from the walls. "It's time." The cabin groaned. The walls seemed to close in. Julia backed away, heart pounding in her chest. The door was too far, and she knew deep down that she wouldn't make it. Something wouldn't let her leave. It never intended to. As Matt stood up, his limbs moved jerkily, like a puppet on strings. And then she saw them. The figures in the corner of the room, dozens of them, shadows, all watching, all waiting. Julia screamed, but the sound swallowed by the cabin, absorbed by the walls like it had never existed. In the stillness of the woods, far from any other soul, the cabin stood silent. The last flicker of light from the windows extinguished. The forest was quiet once more, and the shadows waited for the next to arrive.